Some promises are meant to be kept long after the person who made them is gone. Rosa Windwalker had promised her dying brother she would bring his ashes home to the canyon where they played as children. Now, at 73, she stands at the edge of those same red cliffs, remembering the day that changed everything. She was just 13 when she dove into the flooding river to save her injured hawk. Everyone thought she was crazy, risking her life for a bird. But Rosa came back with more than just her hawk. Deep underwater, she had found an ancient arrowhead, carved with symbols her grandmother spoke of in whispers. The old woman said it belonged to the guardian spirits who once protected their people. For 60 years, Rosa kept that secret buried. Now developers want to build on sacred land, and the river that sustained her people for generations is drying up. What if that arrowhead she found as a girl holds the key to saving everything her ancestors held dear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust kicked up by Rosa's rental car settled like a prayer over the cracked asphalt of Highway 191 as she turned onto the reservation road she hadn't traveled in 40 years. The hand-woven medicine bag containing Miguel's ashes rested on the passenger seat beside her, its intricate patterns catching the late afternoon Arizona sun. Her brother had made her promise, sworn her to it on his deathbed in that sterile Phoenix hospital room, that she would bring him home to Whispering Canyon, to the swimming hole where they'd spent countless summer days as children. The landscape rushed past her windows like scenes from a half-remembered dream. Red sandstone mesas rose from the desert floor like ancient cathedrals, their surfaces carved by wind and time into stories older than any written word. Saguaro cacti stood sentinel along the roadside, their arms raised in permanent benediction toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. This was the country that had shaped her, the earth that had sung her to sleep with coyote songs and awakened her with the harsh cry of red-tailed hawks. But something was wrong. The river that should have been threading silver through the valley bottom was nothing more than a dusty scar, its banks lined with the bleached bones of cottonwoods. Where green had once followed the water's path, only brown remained, a landscape as parched and broken as an old man's heart. Rosa pulled into the parking lot of the Tribal Administration Building, a low-slung structure of tan stucco and red tile that tried too hard to look welcoming. A sign by the entrance proclaimed, "Whispering Canyon Apache Nation, preserving our heritage for future generations." But the words felt hollow against the evidence of drought and struggle visible everywhere she looked. And Rosa? She turned to find a man in his 40s approaching her car, his face a familiar blend of features she remembered from childhood visits. Carlos Benelli had grown up while she was away building her life in the city, but she would have known Miguel's son anywhere. He had his father's steady gaze and the same stubborn set to his jaw that had gotten both her brothers into more trouble than they could handle. Carlos. She embraced him, feeling how thin he'd become, how his work shirt hung loose on his frame. "You look like your father when he was young, and you look like you've been living too well in Phoenix." His smile took the sting out of the words, but Rosa heard the gentle accusation underneath. She had been gone too long, had let comfort and city conveniences keep her away from the people who needed her most. "The drought," she said, gesturing toward the dry riverbed. "How long?" 3 years now, maybe 4. Carlos shook his head. "The young ones, they don't even remember what the river sounded like when it ran full. Elena, you remember Elena Blackhorse? She says the spirits have gone quiet. Says they're waiting for something." Rosa did remember Elena, the old medicine woman had been ancient even when Rosa was a child, bent like a question mark over her walking stick, her eyes sharp as obsidian chips. If Elena was still alive, she had to be pushing 90. "She wants to see you," Carlos continued. "Been asking about you ever since we got word about Uncle Miguel." Says she's been dreaming about you coming home. The tribal offices were nearly empty at this hour, but Carlos led her through hallways lined with photographs of reservation life children at POW. Wows. Elders weaving baskets. Young men in military uniforms from wars stretching back to World War II. Miguel's picture was among them, wearing his dress blues. But Rosa stopped before a different photo, a black and white image of their grandmother, Josephine Windwalker, taken sometime in the 1960s. The old woman stood beside the river. When it ran deep and clear, her hands holding something Rosa couldn't quite make out. The developers came through again last week, Carlos said, following her gaze. Prometheus Land Development. They're calling it Canyon Vista Estates. Luxury homes with golf courses and man-made lakes. They say they can bring jobs. Prosperity. He said the words like they tasted bitter. What they don't say is that their water rights would drain what's left of our aquifer. Rosa felt something cold settle in her stomach. How many are listening? More than I'd like. People are desperate. And Rosa, the casino brings in some money, but not enough. Not near enough. When your children are asking why they can't have what the white kids in Flagstaff have. When your teenagers are leaving for the cities and never coming back. He spread his hands helplessly. It's hard to argue with a check that could solve your immediate problems. They drove through the reservation in Carlos's pickup truck, Rosa's rental car following behind them like a silver shadow. The housing was a mixture of old and new traditional hogans standing beside government-built ranch houses, some well-maintained, others showing the wear of too many seasons and too little money. Gardens that should have been green with summer. Corn and squash lay brown and stunted. Even the dogs seemed listless in the heat. There, Carlos pointed to a modest house at the end of a dirt road, Elena's place. The house was small but immaculate, its walls painted the soft blue-gray of sage smoke. A garden out front defied the drought with carefully tended medicinal plants, desert sage, osha root, and other herbs Rosa remembered from childhood remedies. Wind chimes made from polished river stones hung from the porch, creating a gentle music in the evening breeze. Elena Blackhorse emerged before they could knock, moving with the deliberate care of great age but with eyes that missed nothing. She was smaller than Rosa remembered, her hair now completely white and braided with strips of red cloth, but her presence filled the doorway like smoke from a sacred fire. "Rosa Windwalker," she said, and her voice carried the weight of decades. "You finally came home." "I brought Miguel," Rosa said, lifting the medicine bag. "Like I promised." Elena's eyes fixed on the bag, and for a moment something passed across her features, recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Miguel knew," she said quietly. "At the end, he knew why he had to bring you back. Come inside, granddaughter. We have much to talk about." The interior of Elena's house was a bridge between worlds. Traditional weavings hung beside photographs of grandchildren in graduation caps. A modern television sat dark in one corner, while a small altar occupied another, holding offerings of corn pollen, turquoise, and sage. The smell of cedar and sweetgrass lingered in the air, mixed with the more mundane scents of coffee and fry bread. Elena moved to her kitchen and returned with 2 cups of tea that steamed with an unfamiliar but pleasant aroma. "Drink," she said. "It will help you remember." "Remember what?" "The day you dove into the water. The day you brought back more than just your hawk." Elena's eyes were fixed on Rosa's face, searching. "You still have it, don't you? The thing you found." Rosa's hand moved unconsciously to the base of her throat, where beneath her shirt hung a small leather pouch she had worn for 60 years. Inside that pouch, wrapped in soft doeskin, lay an arrowhead unlike any she had ever seen, made not of flint or obsidian, but of some dark stone that seemed to hold light within its depths. Carved into its surface were symbols that had haunted her dreams for decades, symbols her grandmother had made her promise never to speak of to anyone. "How did you?" "I was there that day, child." I was the one who helped your grandmother hide what you found. I was the one who blessed the pouch you wear." Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I am the one who has been waiting for you to come back and claim your purpose." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mesas, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Rosa of fires long extinguished. Carlos sat quietly in the corner, listening to words that connected him to stories he'd only half believed. Legends that suddenly seemed as real as the drought outside their door. "The developers," Rosa said. "They don't know about. They know something is here," Elena interrupted. "Something valuable. They have machines that can sense things buried deep. Water, minerals, other things." Her weathered hands gripped her teacup, but they don't understand what they're looking for. They think in terms of dollars and cents, not in terms of balance and protection. Rosa felt the weight of the medicine bag on her lap, felt the weight of promises made to the living and the dead. Miguel had known somehow that bringing her home would mean more than just scattering his ashes. He had known that the drought and the developers and the desperation of their people were all connected to something that had been waiting in the darkness, beneath the water for 60 years. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked. Elena smiled, and for a moment, Rosa saw in her face the young woman she must have been decades ago, full of strength and purpose. "What you were born to do, granddaughter. What your grandmother trained you for without either of you knowing it." She stood and moved to her altar, returning with a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. "But first, you need to remember how to see with more than just your eyes." The bundle contained items Rosa recognized from childhood: eagle feathers, small stones worn smooth by water, crystals that caught the lamplight like captured stars. But there was something else, something that made Rosa's breath catch in her throat. A photograph, old and faded, showing a young girl standing beside a river with a red-tailed hawk perched on her arm. The girl was herself at 13, and the hawk was Chikan, the companion who had led her into the water and changed the course of her life. At the bottom of the photograph, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, were words that made Rosa's heart pound. "The first guardian returns to the water. The circle begins." Grandmother knew, Rosa whispered. She knew many things. She knew that the guardian spirits of our people had scattered their gifts when the soldiers came. She knew that one day, when the need was great enough, those gifts would have to be gathered again. Elena's voice carried the weight of prophecy. She knew that her granddaughter would be the one to bring them home. As full darkness settled over the reservation, Rosa sat in Elena's living room and felt the shape of her life rearranging itself around truths she had spent 60 years trying to forget. Outside, coyotes began their evening song, their voices carrying across the desert like the ghosts of promises yet to be kept. Tomorrow, she would take Miguel's ashes to the swimming hole where it all began. But tonight, she would prepare for a journey that would take her much deeper than the bottom of any river. The sacred arrowhead around her neck seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to the nearness of home and the presence of others who remembered the old stories. Rosa closed her eyes and, for the first time in decades, allowed herself to listen for the voice of the spirits her grandmother had taught her to hear. In the distance, thunder rumbled across clear skies, and Elena smiled as if she had been expecting it all along. There, Carlos pointed to a modest house at the end of a dirt road. Elena's place. The house was small but immaculate, its walls painted the soft blue-gray of sage smoke. A garden out front defied the drought with carefully tended medicinal plants: desert sage, osha root, and other herbs Rosa remembered from childhood remedies. Wind chimes made from polished river stones hung from the porch, creating a gentle music in the evening breeze. Elena Blackhorse emerged before they could knock, moving with the deliberate care of great age but with eyes that missed nothing. She was smaller than Rosa remembered, her hair now completely white and braided with strips of red cloth. but her presence filled the doorway like smoke from a sacred fire. "Rosa Windwalker," she said, and her voice carried the weight of decades. "You finally came home." "I brought Miguel," Rosa said, lifting the medicine bag. "Like I promised." Elena's eyes fixed on the bag, and for a moment, something passed across her features, recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Miguel knew," she said quietly. "At the end, he knew why he had to bring you back. Come inside, granddaughter. We have much to talk about." The interior of Elena's house was a bridge between worlds. Traditional weavings hung beside photographs of grandchildren in graduation caps. A modern television sat dark in one corner, while a small altar occupied another, holding offerings of corn pollen, turquoise, and sage. The smell of cedar and sweetgrass lingered in the air, mixed with the more mundane scents of coffee and fry bread. Elena moved to her kitchen and returned with 2 cups of tea that steamed with an unfamiliar but pleasant aroma. "Drink," she said. "It will help you remember." "Remember what?" "The day you dove into the water. The day you brought back more than just your hawk." Elena's eyes were fixed on Rosa's face, searching. "You still have it, don't you? The thing you found." Rosa's hand moved unconsciously to the base of her throat, where beneath her shirt hung a small leather pouch she had worn for 60 years. Inside that pouch, wrapped in soft doeskin, lay an arrowhead unlike any she had ever seen, made not of flint or obsidian, but of some dark stone that seemed to hold light within its depths. Carved into its surface were symbols that had haunted her dreams for decades, symbols her grandmother had made her promise never to speak of to anyone. "How did you—" "I was there that day, child. I was the one who helped your grandmother hide what you found. I was the one who blessed the pouch you wear." Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And I am the one who's been waiting for you to come back and claim your purpose." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mesas, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Rosa of fires long extinguished. Carlos sat quietly in the corner, listening to words that connected him to stories he had only half believed, legends that suddenly seemed as real as the drought outside their door. "The developers," Rosa said. "They don't know about. They know something is here," Elena interrupted. "Something valuable. They have machines that can sense things buried deep. Water, minerals, other things." Her weathered hands gripped her teacup, but they don't understand what they're looking for. They think in terms of dollars and cents, not in terms of balance and protection. Rosa felt the weight of the medicine bag on her lap, felt the weight of promises made to the living and the dead. Miguel had known somehow that bringing her home would mean more than just scattering his ashes. He had known that the drought and the developers and the desperation of their people were all connected to something that had been waiting in the darkness, beneath the water for 60 years. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked. Elena smiled, and for a moment Rosa saw in her face the young woman she must have been decades ago, full of strength and purpose. "What you were born to do, granddaughter. What your grandmother trained you for without either of you knowing it." She stood and moved to her altar, returning with a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. "But first, you need to remember how to see with more than just your eyes." The bundle contained items Rosa recognized from childhood: eagle feathers, small stones worn smooth by water, crystals that caught the lamplight like captured stars. But there was something else, something that made Rosa's breath catch in her throat. A photograph, old and faded, showing a young girl standing beside a river with a red-tailed hawk perched on her arm. The girl was herself at 13, and the hawk was Chikan, the companion who had led her into the water and changed the course of her life. At the bottom of the photograph, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, were words that made Rosa's heart pound. "The first guardian returns to the water. The circle begins." Grandmother knew, Rosa whispered. She knew many things. She knew that the guardian spirits of our people had scattered their gifts when the soldiers came. She knew that one day, when the need was great enough, those gifts would have to be gathered again. Elena's voice carried the weight of prophecy. She knew that her granddaughter would be the one to bring them home. As full darkness settled over the reservation, Rosa sat in Elena's living room and felt the shape of her life rearranging itself around truths she had spent 60 years trying to forget. Outside, coyotes began their evening song, their voices carrying across the desert like the ghosts of promises yet to be kept. Tomorrow, she would take Miguel's ashes to the swimming hole where it all began. But tonight, she would prepare for a journey that would take her much deeper than the bottom of any river. The sacred arrowhead around her neck seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to the nearness of home and the presence of others who remembered the old stories. Rosa closed her eyes, and for the first time in decades, allowed herself to listen for the voice of the spirits her grandmother had taught her to hear. In the distance, thunder rumbled across clear skies, and Elena smiled as if she had been expecting. And all along, Rosa woke before dawn in the small guest room of Elena's house, her dreams filled with the sound of rushing water and the cry of hawks. The medicine bag containing Miguel's ashes sat on the knit stand beside her, but it was the other item that drew her attention, a faded photograph that Elena had given her the night before, one she hadn't seen in decades. The image showed a 13-year-old Rosa standing beside what had once been a deep, clear swimming hole, her arm extended toward a magnificent red-tailed hawk perched on her wrist. Chakan's eyes were fierce and intelligent, his russet feathers catching the sunlight like polished copper. Behind them, the river ran full and strong, carving its ancient path through red sandstone walls that rose like cathedral spires toward an endless blue sky. But it wasn't the beauty of the scene that made Rosa's breath catch, it was the expression on her young face. Even in the grainy black and white photograph, she could see the wild intensity in her own eyes, the fearless devotion of a girl who would do anything to protect the creatures she loved. That girl had been willing to risk everything for a wounded bird. What had happened to that courage? You were something else back then, Carlos said from the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. Dad used to tell stories about you and that hawk. Said you two were like one spirit in 2 bodies. Rosa accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that helped ground her in the present moment. I haven't thought about Chakan in years. Really thought about him, I mean. It seemed easier to put all of that away when I moved to the city. Dad said you cried for a week when that hawk finally flew away. 2 weeks. Rosa corrected with a sad smile. And I wasn't just crying because he left. I was crying because I knew I'd never have a connection like that again. With anything. Anyone. Carlos settled into the chair beside her window, where the first light of dawn was painting the mesas in shades of rose and gold. Elena thinks that's why you stayed away so long. She says some people are born to bridge 2 worlds. But it takes courage to live in that space between. Through the window, Rosa could see Elena in her garden, moving slowly among her plants with a watering can that seemed impossibly heavy for her frail frame. Even in the drought, the old woman tended her medicine herbs with the devotion of someone who understood that some things were worth preserving no matter the cost. I found something else, Carlos said, pulling a manila envelope from beneath his arm. When we were going through Uncle Miguel's things for the funeral, he had this hidden behind a loose board in his bedroom wall. Rosa opened the envelope and found herself looking at more photographs. These ones she had never seen before. Miguel, as a young man in military uniform, standing beside other Native American soldiers. Miguel older, wearing traditional dress and holding what appeared to be a ceremonial bundle. And then her heart stopped. Miguel standing beside their grandmother at the very swimming hole where Rosa had found the arrowhead. But it was the last photograph that made her hands shake. It showed Miguel, probably in his 30s, emerging from dark water with something clutched in his raised fist. His expression was one of triumph mixed with reverence. the look of a man who had found something sacred in the depths. He went back. Rosa whispered. After I found the first one, he went back looking for more. First one? Rosa's hand moved to the leather pouch at her throat. For 60 years, she had told no one about what lay hidden beneath her shirt, not even Miguel. The secret had been a burden she carried alone, a weight that had somehow become part of her. Bones. Slowly she untied the leather cord and let the small pouch fall into her palm. With fingers that trembled only slightly, she loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents onto the table. Between them, the arrowhead seemed to drink in the morning light and give it back transformed. It was unlike anything Carlos had ever seen, not the chipped flint or obsidian of traditional points, but something that looked almost metallic, dark as midnight but shot through with veins of color that shifted like oil on water. Carved into its surface were symbols that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of the eye, ancient markings that spoke of power and protection and mysteries older than recorded history. Sweet Jesus, Carlos breathed. That's what you found when you dove after the hawk. It was embedded in the rock wall of an underwater cave. When I grabbed for Chican, my hand closed around this instead. Rosa picked up the arrowhead, and immediately the room seemed to hum with barely audible energy. Grandmother took one look at it and went white as paper. Made me swear on the spirits of our ancestors that I would never tell anyone, never show it to anyone until the time of great need. And you think that time is now? Rosa looked out the window toward the dry riverbed, then back at the photograph of Miguel emerging from the water with his own sacred find. Your father thought so. Elena thinks so. And last night, for the first time in 40 years, I dreamed about Chican. He was flying over the reservation, but his wings were on fire, and he was crying out like he was in pain. Carlos leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of what he was seeing and hearing. As a member of the tribal council, he dealt with practical problems, budgets, water rights, federal regulations. This world of sacred relics and prophetic dreams was territory he had never learned to navigate. Tell me about the day you found it, he said finally. Everything you remember. Rosa closed her eyes and let herself sink back into memory, back to a summer day when the world was green and the river sang with life. I was 13. It was during the monsoon season, and the rains had been heavy for days. The river was higher than I'd ever seen it, fast and dangerous, but beautiful too, like liquid silver flowing through the canyon. She could see it all again with perfect clarity, the way the cottonwoods had bent and whispered in the wind, the way the air had smelled of wet earth and sage. Chican had been with her for almost 2 years by then, a constant companion who rode on her shoulder or her arm, who slept curled against her neck at night like a feathered guardian. That morning, Chican was restless. He kept flying in circles, crying out, landing on my arm just long enough for me to see that something was wrong. His left wing was drooping, and there was blood on his feathers. I followed him to the swimming hole, thinking maybe he'd had a fight with another hawk or gotten tangled in barbed wire. The memory was so vivid she could feel the hot sun on her shoulders, could hear the roar of water over stone. When we got to the edge of the canyon, Chican took off like he was trying to show me something. But the wind caught him wrong, and that injured wing couldn't hold him. He went down into the rapids like a stone. Carlos leaned forward, caught up in the story despite himself. And you went in after him? Without thinking twice. The water was freezing, and so fast it tumbled me like a leaf. I couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe, just kept diving and coming up and diving again. Everyone said I was crazy risking my life for a bird. But you found him. I found him caught in the roots of a drowned tree, about 15 feet down in a pool behind the main current. When I grabbed him, my other hand hit the rock wall of what I thought was just an underwater ledge. But my fingers went into a crack, and there was something there, something that felt like it was meant to be found. Rosa held up the arrowhead again, and this time Carlos could swear he saw light moving within the dark stone. When I brought it to grandmother, she made me repeat the story 3 times. Then she took me to her medicine bundle and showed me drawings, symbols just like these, but drawn on hide that looked ancient even then. What did she say they meant? Guardian spirits, protectors placed by our ancestors in times of great danger. She said there were 7 of them scattered across the sacred places, hidden where only someone pure of heart could find them. Rosa's voice dropped to a whisper. She said that one day, when our people faced their greatest threat, someone would be called to gather them all together. The morning sun had risen high enough to flood the room with golden light, but Rosa felt cold despite the warmth. Looking at Miguel's photographs, seeing the evidence that her brother had spent his life searching for the other guardian relics, she understood that her comfortable existence in Phoenix had been nothing more than a long delay. The real work of her life was only just beginning. There's something else, Carlos said quietly. Something I didn't tell you yesterday. He pulled out his phone and showed her a news article from the Flagstaff paper. Prometheus Land Development isn't just planning a housing development. They're claiming mineral rights to the entire area around the swimming hole. They're talking about strip mining. Rosa felt the arrowhead grow warm in her palm, as if responding to the threat. Outside, Elena had finished her watering and was walking slowly toward the house, her face set with the determination of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. The ceremony ground, Rosa said, understanding flooding through her. They want to dig up the ceremony ground, all of it. The swimming hole, the canyon walls, the burial sites, everything our people have held sacred for 1,000 years. Carlos's voice was tight with anger. They say there's a rare earth mineral deposit down there worth millions, maybe billions. The arrowhead in Rosa's hand pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and she knew with absolute certainty that the time of great need had finally come. Rosa and Carlos drove toward the sacred swimming hole in the pre-dawn darkness, the truck's headlights cutting through shadows that seemed to hold memories of their own. Miguel's ashes rested on Rosa's lap in their medicine bag, but her mind was consumed by the corporate survey stakes they had discovered the evening before bright. Orange markers driven into the earth like wounds, each one bearing the logo of Prometheus Land Development. The stakes formed a grid pattern that encompassed not just the swimming hole, but the entire ceremonial canyon, marking boundaries for destruction with the casual efficiency of people who saw only dollar signs where others saw the sacred. Rosa had counted 47 stakes in all, each one a small violation that added up to something approaching blasphemy. They work fast, Carlos said grimly as they parked at the canyon's edge. Jennifer Walsh, she's their project manager, told the tribal council they'd have preliminary surveys done within the week. Full environmental impact study to follow. Environmental impact study. Rosa tested the words on her tongue like something bitter. What about spiritual impact? What about the impact on everything our people have believed for generations? You know what they'd say to that. Separation of church and state. Economic development versus superstition. Carlos shouldered a canvas bag containing traditional burial offerings, corn pollen, sage, tobacco. The law doesn't recognize sacred sites unless we can prove continuous religious use. And with the river dry for 3 years, we haven't been able to hold water ceremonies. They made their way down the narrow trail that switchbacked along the canyon wall, Rosa moving more carefully than she had as a child, but with muscle memory guiding her feet to the right footholds. The absence of water made the descent easier, but somehow wrong, as if they were walking through the skeleton of a place that had once been alive. At the bottom, the swimming hole was a depression of cracked mud and smooth stones, its banks littered with the survey stakes that marked the intended destruction. Rosa knelt beside what had once been the deepest part of the pool, where the underwater cave had hidden the guardian arrowhead for untold years. "This is where I found it," she said, placing her hand on the dry stone. 15 feet down, and a crack behind that ledge. The water was so clear you could see every pebble on the bottom. Carlos began the traditional burial preparations, sprinkling corn pollen in the 4 directions and lighting a bundle of sage. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying their prayers toward the lightening sky. But as Rosa prepared to scatter Miguel's ashes, voices echoed from the canyon rim above. Survey Team Delta, this is base. We need GPS coordinates on sections 7 through 12 before the cultural liaison arrives. Rosa and Carlos froze as the voices grew closer. Flashlight beams danced along the canyon walls as a survey crew descended the same trail they had just taken, laden with equipment cases and laptop computers. We need to get out of here, Carlos whispered, but Rosa remained. Kneeling beside the dry pool, Miguel's ashes still clutched in her hands. Something about the approaching surveyors filled her with a rage she hadn't felt since childhood. The same fierce protectiveness that had driven her into dangerous waters to save a wounded hawk. No, she said quietly. This is our land, our sacred place. They're the ones who need to leave. The survey team reached the bottom of the canyon just as the sun crested the eastern rim, flooding the space with golden light. There were 4 of them, 3 young men with expensive equipment and a woman in her 30s. Wearing khaki field clothes and an expression of barely contained impatience. Excuse me, the woman called out. This area is restricted for survey work. You'll need to move along. Rosa stood slowly, still holding the medicine bag. The woman had blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail and the kind of pale skin that spoke of air-conditioned offices and indoor work. Her boots were new and clean, unmarked by actual hiking. I'm Jennifer Walsh, project manager for Prometheus Land Development. We have legal authorization to conduct surveys in this area. The woman's voice carried the assumption that bureaucratic authority trumped everything else. And I'm Rosa Windwalker, Rosa replied, matching the woman's tone. This is my nephew, Carlos Benelli, member of the Tribal Council. This is our sacred burial ground, and we're conducting a ceremony. Jennifer's expression shifted from impatience to something approaching calculation. I'm sorry for your loss, but we have deadlines to meet. Surely you can conduct your ceremony elsewhere. Would you dig up Arlington National Cemetery for a housing development? Carlos asked, stepping forward. Would you tell grieving families to conduct their ceremony elsewhere? That's not the same thing, Jennifer said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. We're talking about economic development. That will benefit everyone. Jobs, tax revenue, modern infrastructure. Rosa felt the arrowhead around her neck grow warm against her skin. Looking at Jennifer Walsh, she saw not malice but ignorance, the dangerous blindness of someone who had never learned to see beyond the surface of things. What do you know about this place? Rosa asked. Its history? Its significance? I know it's been dry for 3 years. I know it's not currently serving any practical purpose. Jennifer gestured toward the survey stakes. We're proposing to restore water access through our development. Man-made lakes, irrigation systems, golf courses. This desert will be green again. Green with non-native grass watered by pumps that will drain the aquifer dry, Carlos countered. Green for people who can afford million-dollar homes while the community that's lived here for centuries gets pushed out by property taxes they can't pay. The survey team had begun setting up their equipment, seemingly oblivious to the tension building around them. GPS units beeped and surveying instruments unfolded with mechanical precision. Each device designed to reduce the sacred landscape to coordinates and elevations. Look, Jennifer said, softening her tone slightly. I understand this is emotional for you. Change is always difficult. But progress doesn't have to be the enemy of tradition. We're planning to incorporate native American design elements into the development. Maybe a small memorial garden interpretive signs about local history. Rosa stared at the woman for a long moment, trying to find words for the vast gulf between Jennifer's understanding and the reality of what this place meant. How could she explain that the rocks themselves held prayers? That the very ground they stood on had been blessed by thousands of ceremonies stretching back to time immemorial? "You want to turn our cathedral into a shopping mall," Rosa said finally. "And you think a memorial plaque will make that acceptable." "I think a memorial plaque is more than most developers would offer," Jennifer replied, her professional patience beginning to fray. "Look, Miss Windwalker, I respect your cultural heritage, but sentiment doesn't pay bills or provide jobs for young people who are leaving the reservation because there's nothing here for them." The words hit Rosa like a physical blow because they contained just enough truth to hurt. She had left the reservation herself, had built a comfortable life in Phoenix while her people struggled with poverty and isolation. Who was she to lecture anyone about cultural preservation when she had spent 40 years preserving nothing but her own comfort? But as she looked around the canyon, at the survey stakes driven into sacred ground, at the equipment designed to map the location for its destruction, Rosa felt something stirring within her that had been dormant since she was 13 years old. The same fierce love that had driven her into dangerous waters was awakening, tempered now by the wisdom of age, but no less powerful. "You're right about one thing," Rosa said, surprising everyone, including herself. "Young people are leaving because they don't see a future here. But not because there's nothing for them, because they've forgotten what there is. We've all forgotten." She opened the medicine bag and began scattering Miguel's ashes into the dry pool, each handful accompanied by a prayer in the old language. The survey team stopped their work to watch, recognizing the solemnity of the moment, if not its deeper significance. "This isn't over," Jennifer Walsh said quietly as Rosa completed the ceremony. "No," Rosa agreed, feeling the arrowhead pulse against her chest. "It's just beginning." That evening, Rosa sat in Elena's kitchen while the old medicine woman prepared tea from herbs that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Carlos had called an emergency meeting of the tribal elders, and the small house was filling with men and women whose faces told the story of a people who had survived more than their share of threats. Robert Yazzie, the eldest council member, studied the faded photographs Miguel had left behind with the intensity of someone reading scripture. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he traced the outline of the arrowhead Rosa had revealed to them. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of stories passed down through generations. "My grandfather told me about these," he said slowly. 7 sacred guardians, scattered when the cavalry came in 1882. He said they were hidden by the medicine people to keep them safe from those who would use their power for destruction. Robert looked up at Rosa with eyes that had seen 87 winters. He also said that one day, when our people faced extinction, a guardian keeper would arise to gather them together. "Guardian keeper?" Rosa asked. Elena set down her teacup and pulled a leather-bound journal from beneath a stack of blankets. The cover was soft with age, its edges worn smooth by countless careful handlings. "Your grandmother's journal, she said. She left it in my care when she passed, with instructions to give it to you when the time was right." Rosa accepted the journal with hands that shook slightly. Opening it felt like stepping into a sacred space, each page covered with her grandmother's careful handwriting in both English and the traditional Apache script. Maps drawn in faded ink showed the locations of water sources, ceremonial sites, and burial grounds. But it was the section devoted to the 7 guardian relics that made Rosa's breath catch. The first page showed a detailed drawing of her arrowhead, accompanied by notes that spoke of water protection and river blessings. The following pages depicted 6 other sacred objects: a carved bone flute, a crystal medicine wheel, a jade hawk pendant, an obsidian knife, a silver bracelet inscribed with star maps, and a stone bowl decorated with spiral patterns. She knew Rosa whispered, reading her grandmother's words. She knew I would find the first one. She knew I would be the one to gather them all. Read the prophecy, Elena urged, pointing to a passage written in red ink that seemed to glow in the lamplight. Rosa read aloud, translating the Apache words as she went. When the earth grows sick and the waters fail, when the sacred places face destruction and the people forget their connection to the spirits, 7 guardians will awaken. The one who first touched the water guardian will be called to gather the scattered power and restore the balance. But beware the guardians exact a price from those who would wield them. The keeper must choose between personal peace and the survival of the people. Thomas Begay, another elder, leaned forward with interest. The water guardian, that's what you found in the river? Rosa nodded, touching the pouch at her throat. But according to this map, the other 6 are scattered across 3 states. Some might be in museums, others in private collections. How could we possibly find them all, much less convince people to give them up? Miguel found 3 of them, Elena said quietly. Over the years, he tracked down families who had inherited sacred objects without knowing their true significance. He traded for some, bought others, spent his entire military pension acquiring them. She stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. He brought them to me for safekeeping, said his sister would need them someday. Elena opened the chest and carefully withdrew 3 bundles, wrapped in red cloth. The first contained the bone flute, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the lamplight. The second held the crystal medicine wheel, a perfect circle of clear quartz that split the room's light into rainbows. The third revealed the jade hawk pendant, its green surface polished to mirror brightness and warm to the touch. 4 of 7, Carlos said, wonder creeping into his voice. We're more than halfway there. Miguel left notes about the others, Elena continued, producing a manila folder thick with documents. The obsidian knife is in a private collection. In Santa Fe belongs to a wealthy art dealer who doesn't know what he has. The silver bracelet was donated to the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff 20 years ago. And the stone bowl. She paused, consulting Miguel's careful notes. That one might be the most difficult. It's part of a display at the Smithsonian. Rosa felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what her grandmother and brother had expected of her. She was a retired schoolteacher, not an adventurer or a spiritual warrior. How was she supposed to convince museums and collectors to give up valuable artifacts based on family legends and prophecies? There's something else, Robert Yazzie said, studying the journal's maps. According to this, the ceremony to awaken the guardians has to be performed at the exact spot where the water guardian was found, during the new moon. And all 7 guardians must be present. When's the next new moon? Rosa asked. Carlos checked his phone. 11 days. 11 days to gather 3 sacred objects from institutions that probably won't even return our phone calls, Rosa said. And that's assuming we can get them to believe our story in the first place. We have something they don't expect, Elena said with a slight smile. We have truth on our side, and truth has a power all its own. She gathered the 4 guardian relics and arranged them in a semicircle on the table. Look at them together. Really look. Rosa focused on the objects, her water guardian arrowhead, Miguel's bone flute, crystal wheel, and jade pendant. As she watched, each began to emit a soft glow, their light pulsing in rhythm like synchronized heartbeats. The air in the room grew thick with energy, and she could have sworn she heard distant music, as if the bone flute were playing itself. They're calling to the others, Elena whispered. The scattered guardians are awakening. Those who possess them will start having dreams, visions. They'll know something significant is happening, even if they don't understand what. Thomas Begay nodded slowly. My nephew works at the Museum of Northern Arizona. He could tell us who to contact about the bracelet. And I have a cousin in Santa Fe, added another elder. She knows the art dealers might be able to help with the knife. What about the Smithsonian? Rosa asked. Elena's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. Leave that to me. I have connections you might not expect. As the evening wore on, Rosa found herself surrounded by a planning session that felt part prayer circle, part military strategy meeting. Maps were consulted, phone numbers exchanged, travel arrangements discussed. The elders spoke with the quiet determination of people who had faced impossible odds before and somehow survived. But it was Elena's final words that stayed with Rosa as she prepared for sleep. Remember, granddaughter, the Guardians chose you just as much as you chose them. They've been waiting 60 years for someone strong enough to carry their burden. Don't let fear convince you that you're not worthy of their trust. Outside, thunder rumbled across clear skies for the second night in a row, and Rosa fell asleep to the sound of rain that wasn't falling, listening for voices in the wind that carried promises of power and change. The sun had barely risen when Rosa stood waist-deep in what remained of the sacred pool, her wetsuit borrowed from the tribal fire department and her breathing apparatus checking and rechecking itself with mechanical precision. 3 days had passed since the elders' meeting, and despite Elena's confidence about connections, securing the remaining Guardian relics was proving more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Carlos stood on the bank with diving equipment spread around him like offerings to some modern god of exploration. The water that had begun seeping back into the canyon during the night barely reached Rosa's chest, not nearly deep enough to access the underwater cave where she had found the first Guardian 60 years ago. The water table is too low, Carlos said, consulting readings from a borrowed ground-penetrating radar unit. According to this, the cave entrance is still 12 feet underwater, but there's only about 6 feet of water in the deepest part of the pool. Rosa adjusted the diving mask that felt alien on her 73-year-old face. She had been an Olympic-level swimmer as a teenager, but that was 6 decades and a lifetime of desk work ago. The very idea of attempting such a dive should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only a strange calm, as if the water itself were welcoming her home. Elena said the cave system extends back into the canyon wall for nearly 100 feet, she said. If there are other entrances, other Guardian relics hidden back there, and if you get lost in underwater tunnels that haven't been mapped since before the reservation was established. Carlos's voice carried the weight of someone who'd already lost, too many family members to take unnecessary risks. Rosa touched the medicine bundle Elena had given her, a collection of sacred items designed to provide spiritual protection during dangerous journeys. Sage for purification, turquoise for safe travel, an eagle feather for connection to the spirit world. She felt like a fraud carrying such powerful symbols, a city-dwelling schoolteacher playing at being a medicine woman. I have to try, she said. Jennifer Walsh called the tribal council yesterday. Prometheus has moved up their timeline. They want to begin preliminary excavation next week. Next week? Carlos dropped the depth gauge he'd been calibrating. They said they needed environmental impact studies, federal permits. Apparently, their lawyers found a loophole. Some kind of emergency development clause that allows them to begin work while the studies are pending. Rosa waded deeper into the pool, feeling the sandy bottom give way to smooth stone carved by countless years of flowing water. If we don't find a way to stop them legally, or spiritually, or both, this place will be gone before the new moon ceremony. The diving attempt lasted 30 minutes and yielded nothing but frustration. The water was murky with stirred sediment, the cave entrance partially blocked by debris from decades of flash floods. Rosa managed to reach the opening where she had found the first Guardian, but the passage beyond was too narrow and unstable for safe exploration. When she finally surfaced, coughing and disappointed, Elena was waiting on the bank with an expression that mixed concern with something approaching relief. The spirits are not ready. the old medicine woman said simply. The water must rise before the cave will reveal its secrets. The water isn't going to rise, Rosa replied, pulling off the diving mask with shaking hands. There's no rain in the forecast, no snow in the mountains. This drought could last another year, maybe more. Elena's weathered face creased into a smile. You still think like a white woman sometimes, granddaughter. Rain comes from clouds, yes, but water comes from many sources. That afternoon, Rosa found herself in the unlikely position of sitting across a polished conference table from Jennifer Walsh in the Prometheus Land Development Field Office, a double-wide trailer that had sprouted from the desert like a mechanical mushroom. The walls were covered with architectural renderings of Canyon Vista estates, computer-generated images of golf courses and swimming pools superimposed over the sacred landscape like a fever dream of suburban conquest. I appreciate you coming in, Jennifer said, though her tone suggested anything but appreciation. I wanted to discuss a proposition that might benefit both parties. Rosa studied the woman across from her, noting the expensive suit that looked out of place in the desert heat, the manicured nails that had never touched real earth, the confident posture of someone accustomed to getting her way through a combination of legal pressure and financial incentive. What kind of proposition? Jennifer slid a folder across the table. Prometheus is prepared to offer significant compensation to tribal members who are willing to relocate. Not just fair market value for your homes, but relocation assistance, job training, even college scholarships for young people. Rosa opened the folder to find checks already made out in amounts that would have solved most families' immediate financial problems. The largest was made out to her personally enough money to ensure comfortable retirement anywhere she chose to live. We understand this is your ancestral homeland, Jennifer continued. We're not trying to erase that history, but we are offering your people a chance to be part of Arizona's economic future instead of trapped in its struggling past. And in return, you help us convince the tribal council to accept our offer. You use your influence as a respected community member to show people that this development represents opportunity, not loss. Jennifer leaned forward, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Look, Rosa, I can call you Rosa. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen communities like yours before. The young people leave, the old traditions fade away, and eventually there's nothing left but poverty and nostalgia. Rosa felt a familiar anger rising, the same protective fury that had driven her into dangerous water as a child. But now it was tempered by the wisdom of age, controlled and focused like a blade heated in forge fires. What you're describing isn't inevitable, she said quietly. It's a choice. Communities die when people stop believing they're worth fighting for. Fighting for what? A dry riverbed and a handful of stories that don't pay anyone's bills? Jennifer gestured toward the window, where survey stakes dotted the landscape like grave markers. We're offering real jobs, real prosperity, a real future. Rosa stood and walked to the window, looking out over land that held the prayers and dreams of 1,000 generations. In the distance, she could see Carlos leading a group of high school students on what their teacher had called a cultural heritage project. Young people learning to identify traditional plants, to read the stories written in stone, to listen for the voices that spoke from wind and water. You see empty desert, Rosa said. I see a library that's been accumulating wisdom for millennia. You see unused land. I see the spiritual heart of a people who have survived everything from cavalry charges to government, boarding schools to corporate lawyers. She turned back to Jennifer, who was watching her with the calculating expression of a poker player trying to read an opponent's hand. The answer is no. Jennifer's professional smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could resolve this amicably. She closed the folder of checks with a sharp snap. I should mention that Prometheus has retained some of the best water rights lawyers in the Southwest. If this goes to court, it could get very expensive for the tribe. Very expensive and very public. Rosa felt the guardian arrowhead pulse against her chest, warm with what felt like approval. Some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Even if fighting means losing everything? Especially then, Rosa replied, walking toward the door. Because sometimes the only way to save what matters is to risk everything you have. As she left the trailer, Rosa could feel Jennifer Walsh's eyes on her back, calculating and cold. The battle lines were drawn now, and there would be no more attempts at negotiation or compromise. It would be ceremony against legal briefs, tradition against development, the old ways against the new, with the spiritual heart of her people hanging in the balance. Rosa knelt in the dust beside the tribal high school's archaeology site, watching 17-year-old Maria Santos carefully brush sediment from what appeared to be a pottery fragment. The girl worked with the focused intensity of someone who had found something worth preserving, her movements precise despite the excitement that made her hands tremble slightly. "Miss Windwalker, look at this," Maria said, holding up the shard with reverence. The piece was no larger than her palm, but even through the coating of centuries-old dirt, Rosa could see the unmistakable spiral patterns that matched the drawings. In her grandmother's journal, the pottery fragment bore symbols that seemed to pulse with their own, rhythm spirals within spirals, connected by flowing lines that suggested water, wind, and the eternal dance between earth and sky. At the center of the largest spiral was a symbol Rosa had never seen before, but which felt familiar nonetheless, as if her grandmother had whispered its meaning in dreams she couldn't quite remember. "Where exactly did you find this?" Rosa asked, accepting the fragment with hands that shook slightly. The pottery was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been after lying buried in cool earth. About 3 feet down, near the old fire ring site. "But there's more." Maria led Rosa to a carefully excavated square, where other students were working under the supervision of their cultural studies teacher. "We found pieces from at least 6 different vessels, all with similar markings, and underneath them, The girl pointed to a layer of sediment that showed the distinctive patterns of ash and charcoal. A fire pit that could be hundreds of years old, maybe older. Our teacher thinks this might have been a ceremonial site." Rosa felt her breath catch as she studied the excavation. According to her grandmother's journal, the 7 guardian relics had been scattered during a great ceremony performed just before the cavalry attacks of 1882. The medicine people had gathered at 7 sacred sites, performing rituals to hide. The guardians were only those pure of heart could find them. Could this be one of those original ceremony sites? "Has anyone from Prometheus seen this?" Rosa asked. "Not yet. We were going to report the find to the tribal council first, get permission to expand the excavation." Maria's teacher, a young Apache woman named Dr. Sarah Begay, approached with another pottery fragment in her gloved hands. "This changes everything, doesn't it? If we can prove continuous ceremonial use of this area, federal law requires protection of the site." Rosa nodded, but her attention was drawn to something else, a symbol carved into the stone of the old fire ring itself, almost invisible beneath centuries of soot and weathering. The mark was small, no larger than her thumb, but it matched exactly one of the guardian symbols from her grandmother's journal, the symbol for the 5th guardian, the obsidian knife. "Dr. Begay," Rosa said carefully, "have you found any worked? Stone? Tools, weapons, anything with a sharp edge?" "Actually, yes. We found what appears to be a ceremonial blade yesterday, but it's still embedded in the stone matrix. We were planning to extract it properly tomorrow." The young archaeologist led Rosa to a section of the excavation covered by a protective tarp. "It's unusual. The obsidian appears to be from sources hundreds of miles away, suggesting it was brought here specifically for ceremony." Rosa pulled back the tarp and felt her heart stop. There, partially exposed in the ancient stone, was the unmistakable outline of a knife blade that seemed to drink light from the sky. Even covered in sediment and embedded in rock, she could see the flowing patterns carved into the obsidian, the same intricate designs that marked all 7 guardian relics. "This site needs to be protected immediately," Rosa said, her voice tight with urgency. "Fenced off, posted with security, documented by federal archaeologists. Everything. We're working on it, but these things take time," Dr. Begay replied. "Permit applications, environmental reviews, cultural impact studies, even with federal protection laws. It could take weeks to get the proper authorization. We don't have weeks." Rosa looked across the desert toward the Prometheus field office, where she could see vehicles and equipment gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. "Jennifer Walsh is planning to begin excavation next Monday. If she destroys this site before we can establish its protected status." Her words were interrupted by the roar of heavy machinery approaching from the access road. A convoy of trucks was heading toward them, loaded with bulldozers and earth-moving equipment, but looked capable of reducing the entire archaeological site to rubble in a matter of hours. "Pack everything up," Rosa said urgently. "All the pottery, all your notes, all your photographs. Get it to the tribal council building where it will be safe." But even as the students scrambled to secure their finds, Rosa knew that documentation alone wouldn't be enough. The obsidian knife had to be extracted from its stone matrix, had to be added to the 4 guardians already in her possession. Without it, the ceremony to awaken the guardian spirits would be incomplete, and all their efforts to save the sacred site would be meaningless. The lead truck in the convoy pulled to a stop near the excavation site, and Jennifer Walsh climbed down from the passenger seat with the satisfied expression of someone who had just played a winning hand. She was followed by 2 men in expensive suits who moved with the predatory confidence of lawyers prepared to argue their case to the Supreme Court if necessary. "Ms. Windwalker," Jennifer called out with false cheerfulness, "I see you've been busy. Archaeological exploration is such fascinating work, isn't it?" "This is a protected site," Dr. Begay said, stepping forward with official documents in her hand. "We filed preliminary paperwork with the Arizona State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service. Federal law requires completed applications and approved permits." One of the lawyers interrupted smoothly. "Preliminary paperwork carries no legal weight. We have existing permits and development rights that supersede any archaeological claims unless and until they are properly adjudicated." Rosa felt the guardian arrowhead around her neck pulse with heat, as if responding to the threat. Looking at the massive earth-moving equipment, at the lawyers with their briefcases full of carefully crafted arguments, at the pottery fragments that held the spiritual history of her people, she realized that legal battles and federal bureaucracy would not save what needed to be saved. "How long do we have?" she asked. Jennifer checked her expensive watch with theatrical precision. "The environmental impact study was just approved this morning. We begin site preparation at 8 a.m. Monday. 3 days." Her smile was all sharp edges and corporate efficiency. "I'm sorry, Rosa. I really did hope we could work something out." As the Prometheus convoy rumbled away toward their base camp, Rosa knelt once more beside the exposed obsidian knife. The blade seemed to call to her across the centuries, its dark surface reflecting light that came from no visible source. She thought of her grandmother's warnings about the price of wielding guardian power, about the choice between personal peace and the survival of the people. 3 days to extract the sacred relic from solid stone. 3 days to find a way to stop federal permits and corporate lawyers and the inexorable machinery of development. 3 days to prove that some things were more valuable than the mineral wealth buried beneath them. Rosa placed her hand on the warm stone above the knife and felt power flowing up from the earth itself, ancient and patient and utterly uncompromising. The Guardians were awakening, just as Elena had predicted. The question now was whether their awakening would come in time to save the sacred places that had sheltered them for more than a century. Rosa sat in the lamplight of Elena's kitchen, carefully cleaning the obsidian knife that the archaeology students had managed to extract from its stone matrix just hours before Prometheus equipment arrived to secure the site. The blade seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its surface carved with symbols that appeared to move when viewed from the corner of her eye. This was the fifth Guardian, leaving only 2 more to complete the circle of 7. But it was Miguel's bronze star medal that had captured her attention now, the military decoration she had found wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of his belongings. She had assumed it was simply a memento of his service in Vietnam, one more piece of a brother's life she had never fully understood. Now, holding it under Elena's magnifying glass, she could see tiny markings etched into the bronze markings that matched the symbols in her grandmother's journal. "He was more than just a soldier," Elena said quietly, settling into her chair with a cup of tea that steamed with the scent of sage and something else Rosa couldn't identify. Miguel was part of a network of guardian keepers, people scattered across tribal lands who spent their lives tracking down and protecting the sacred relics. Rosa turned the medal over in her hands, feeling its weight both physical and spiritual. Why didn't he tell me? All these years, he knew what I was carrying, knew about the ceremony, knew about the prophecy. Why keep it secret? Because you weren't ready. You had chosen the white world, chosen comfort over responsibility. Miguel understood that the Guardians would call you home when the time was right. Elena reached into a wooden box beside her chair and withdrew a leather portfolio that looked military in origin. "He left this for you, with instructions to give it to you only after you had accepted your role as the final keeper." The portfolio contained maps, photographs, and correspondence spanning decades. Rosa found herself looking at images of Miguel in locations across the Southwest to standing beside museum displays, meeting with collectors, photographing artifacts in private homes. Each image was annotated with careful notes about guardian relics, their locations, their histories, their spiritual significance. But it was the final section of the portfolio that made Rosa's hands shake. A letter addressed to her and Miguel's. Careful handwriting, dated just 3 weeks before his death. "My dear sister," she read aloud, her voice catching on the familiar words. "If you are reading this, then the time of great need has finally come, and you have accepted the burden our grandmother placed on you so many years ago. I know this was not the life you wanted. You dreamed of teaching children, of building a quiet existence far from the old stories and the old responsibilities. But the spirits knew better than we did what would be required of you." The letter went on to detail Miguel's years of searching, his careful work to track down the scattered guardians without alerting those who would exploit their power. He had been part of a secret network of Native American veterans who used their military training and federal connections to protect sacred sites and artifacts from commercialization and destruction. "The knife you found today was hidden by our great-grandfather in 1882, Rosa continued reading. "He was present at the final ceremony, when the 7 guardians were scattered to prevent them from falling into the hands of those who would use their power for conquest rather than protection. The 6th guardian, the silver bracelet, was taken by the cavalry, but recovered 20 years ago by a Hopi friend of mine. It is now in the Museum of Northern Arizona, catalogued as item number 1987.04.215. Rosa looked up from the letter to find Elena watching her with knowing eyes. "He found 6 of them?" "All but the 7th. The stone bowl remained hidden, even from Miguel's network." Elena sipped her tea thoughtfully. "But he suspected where it might be, and his suspicions led him to make contact with someone very unexpected." The letter's next paragraph made Rosa's heart race. "The 7th guardian, The stone bowl that binds all the others together is indeed in the Smithsonian Institution, as you discovered. But it is not simply part of their collection. It is there because Dr. James Crowfeather, the museum's assistant director of Native American cultural preservation, is himself a guardian keeper. He has been protecting it for 30 years, waiting for the one who could unite all 7. Dr. Crowfeather is Miguel's contact? Rosa asked, hardly believing what she was reading. Elena nodded. A Lakota man whose great-grandmother was present at the original scattering ceremony. She told him stories, passed down the knowledge, prepared him to serve as guardian until the time of reunification. The old woman smiled. Miguel and James have been corresponding for years, planning for this moment. The good doctor is expecting your call. Rosa felt the weight of revelation settling around her like a heavy cloak. Her brother hadn't just been collecting sacred artifacts. He had been part of an elaborate, decades-long preparation for this exact moment. The network of protectors, the careful documentation, the strategic placement of allies in museums and universities. It had all been leading to this confrontation between the guardian spirits and those who would destroy the sacred places they protected. There's more, Elena said, pointing to the final page of Miguel's letter. Read the last part. Rosa's eyes moved to her brother's final words. The drought that has plagued our people for 3 years is not entirely natural. Prometheus Land Development has been working with federal water management agencies to redirect underground flows away from tribal lands and toward their proposed development sites. They have been artificially starving our sacred places of the water that gives them life, weakening the spiritual barriers that protect them. When you perform the guardian ceremony, you will not just be awakening protective spirits. You will be restoring the natural flow of water that has sustained our people for millennia. The implications hit Rosa like a physical blow. They've been stealing our water to make the drought worse. Corporate water rights are complicated legal instruments, Elena said grimly. But yes, essentially, they have been draining the underground sources that feed our sacred springs and pools, making the land appear worthless, unusable, suitable only for development. Her eyes flashed with anger. They create the problem, then offer themselves as the solution. Rosa stood and walked to the window, looking out over the moonlit landscape toward the dry riverbed that had once sustained generations of her people. Understanding the scope of the conspiracy, the manipulation, the legal maneuvering, the systematic destruction of her people's connection to their ancestral lands filled her with a rage that was both personal and cosmic. How do we stop them? The same way our ancestors stopped the cavalry in 1882, Elena replied. With ceremony, with prayer, and with the power of the guardian spirits properly awakened and unified. She joined Rosa at the window, her weathered hand reaching out to touch the glass. But first, you must gather the final 2 guardians. Dr. Crowfeather will help with the stone bowl, but the silver bracelet ... double quotes. She paused, consulting Miguel's notes. That will require a different kind of negotiation. Rosa felt the 5 guardian relics calling to her from their places around Elena's house, their combined energy creating a resonance she could feel in her bones. The water guardian arrowhead at her throat, Miguel's bone flute and crystal wheel and jade pendant in their sacred bundles. The obsidian knife, still warm from its extraction from ancient stone. They were awakening to the presence of their keeper, recognizing the approaching moment of their reunification. Tomorrow, Rosa said, decision crystallizing in her voice like ice forming on still water. Tomorrow we contact Dr. Crowfeather and arrange to retrieve the stone bowl. We get the silver bracelet from the museum, and we prepare for a ceremony. That will either save our sacred places or see them destroyed in the attempt. Outside, thunder rolled across clear skies for the 4th night in a row, and Rosa felt the first drops of rain that had fallen on the reservation in 3 years. The guardians were indeed awakening, and with them, the ancient powers that had shaped the land, before corporate lawyers and development permits had ever been imagined. The final battle was beginning, and Rosa Windwalker, schoolteacher, city dweller, reluctant keeper of sacred trust, was ready to discover whether the courage that had driven her into dangerous waters as a child could carry her through the deeper waters that lay ahead. Rosa stood at the edge of the sacred pool in the pre-dawn darkness, the traditional diving stones Elena had given her weighing heavy in her hands. These weren't modern diving weights, but ancient ceremonial objects, each one carved with symbols of water blessing and spiritual protection, blessed by generations of medicine people for underwater journeys that bridged the physical and spiritual worlds. The rain that had begun 4 nights ago had continued with steadily increasing intensity, and the pool that had been nothing but cracked mud a week earlier now held 6 feet of clear, cold water. More water than had flowed through the canyon in 3 years, appearing as if summoned by the awakening guardian spirits themselves. "The ancestors are providing," Elena said, standing beside her with the complete collection of guardian relics arranged on a blanket of red wool. All 7 were now gathered: Rosa's water guardian arrowhead, Miguel's bone flute, crystal wheel, and jade pendant, the obsidian knife from the archaeological site, and the final 2 retrieved to what could only be described as miraculous. Intervention. Dr. James Shrove Feather had not only released the stone bowl from the Smithsonian, but had personally driven it from Washington, D.C., arriving the previous evening with stories of visions and dreams that had told him the time of reunification had come. The Museum of Northern Arizona had proven more resistant until their chief curator experienced 3 consecutive nights of dreams featuring red-tailed hawks with burning wings, dreams so vivid and disturbing that she had called Rosa personally to arrange the transfer of the silver bracelet. Now all 7 guardians lay on the sacred blanket, each one glowing with subtle inner light that pulsed in rhythm like synchronized heartbeats. The combined energy was almost overwhelming, creating a field of power that made the air itself seem alive with electricity. "You understand what you're attempting?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent 90 years preparing for this moment. "The ceremony your great-grandfather performed in 1882 scattered the Guardian's power to keep it safe. What you're about to do will reunify that power, concentrate it into a protective barrier around all the sacred places of our people. But such power comes with a price." Rosa nodded, though she wasn't certain she truly understood the magnitude of what she was attempting. The traditional breathing techniques Elena had taught her over the past week felt inadequate preparation for a spiritual journey that might take her deeper than any physical dive. But the sacred pool was calling to her with the same irresistible pull she had felt as a 13-year-old girl following her wounded hawk into dangerous waters. "The breathing stones will help you stay connected to this world while your spirit travels in the realm of the guardians," Elena continued, placing each carved stone into a leather pouch that Rosa would carry with her underwater. "But remember, you must unite all 7 guardians at the exact spot where you found the first one. In the underwater cave, at the place where the Earth's power flows strongest." Carlos emerged from the morning mist carrying underwater lighting equipment and safety lines that looked impossibly modern against the ancient ritual taking place around him. As the only certified rescue diver among them, he would monitor Rosa's progress from above, ready to pull her to safety if the ceremony went wrong. "The Prometheus crews are mobilizing," he reported grimly. "Jennifer Walsh has accelerated their timeline again. They plan to begin blasting operations at noon today, ceremony or no ceremony. Their lawyers have convinced a federal judge that archaeological concerns don't supersede existing development permits." Rosa felt her heart clench with the familiar mixture of protectiveness and rage that had driven her actions since childhood. In 6 hours, explosives would shatter the rock formations that held the underground cave system. In 6 hours, The sacred pool would be drained and filled with concrete foundations for luxury homes. Unless the guardian ceremony could awaken power strong enough to stop federal permits and corporate machinery. "Then we begin now," she said, accepting the waterproof pouch containing all 7 guardian relics. The weight was significant but manageable, and the moment the pouch touched her hands, she felt energy flowing up her arms like warm electricity. Elena began the preparatory blessing, burning sage and cedar while chanting in the old language that seemed to make the very stones resonate with harmonic frequencies. Dr. Crowfeather joined the ceremony, his deep voice adding Lakota prayers that wove together with Elena's Apache chants to create something larger than either tradition alone. As the blessing reached its crescendo, Rosa stepped into the pool and felt the water welcome her like an embrace from a long-lost lover. The temperature should have been shockingly cold, but instead it felt perfectly balanced, as if the spring itself were regulating its warmth to protect her during the journey ahead. The diving stones carried her down through water, so clear she could see every detail of the cave entrance that had been hidden for 3 years of drought. But this was not the same narrow, debris-choked opening she had struggled to reach a week earlier. The cave mouth had somehow expanded, its walls smooth and inviting, marked with pictographs that glowed with their own inner light. At 15 feet, Rosa paused at the threshold between the physical world and whatever lay beyond. The cave extended back into the canyon wall farther than her lights could penetrate, its walls lined with crystalline formations that caught and reflected her lamp beams into patterns of impossible beauty. But it was the water itself that captured her attention, not the muddy, sediment-laden flow of a desert spring, but water so pure it seemed to hold light within its molecules. Following the stone-carved passages deeper into the earth, Rosa found herself in a chamber that defied physical possibility. The space was larger than the entire canyon above, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to contain stars. Along the walls, 7 alcoves had been carved from living rock, each one designed to hold a specific guardian relic. This was the original ceremonial chamber, the place where her ancestors had first gathered the 7 guardians before scattering them to safety. And at the center of the chamber, rising from the floor like a natural altar, stood a pillar of stone that pulsed with the same rhythm as the guardian relics in her pouch. Rosa swam to the pillar and found handholds carved into its surface, ancient grips that fit her hands as if they had been shaped specifically for her fingers. Climbing the pillar while maintaining neutral buoyancy required skills she had never learned, but somehow her body knew the movements. Guided by genetic memory or spiritual intervention, at the top of the pillar, she found what could only be described as a map, not carved into the stone, but somehow visible within it, showing the location of every sacred site for hundreds of miles around. Springs, burial grounds, ceremony sites, places of power that formed a network of spiritual protection across the entire Southwest. And she could see the damage, the places where water had been diverted, where sacred sites had been destroyed, where the network had been broken. The guardian ceremony required her to place each relic in its proper alcove while maintaining contact with the central pillar. One by one, Rosa positioned the sacred objects, feeling power flow between them as each connection was completed. The bone flute in the alcove marked with wind symbols, the crystal wheel where light gathered most strongly, the jade pendant in the space that hummed with the frequency of growing things. With each placement, the chamber grew brighter, the water around her beginning to glow with phosphorescent energy that seemed to come from the living rock itself. She could feel the spiritual network reawakening, power flowing along underground channels that connected sacred sites across thousands of square miles. But it was the placement of the final guardian, her own water arrowhead, that triggered the true awakening. As she set the relic into its alcove, the chamber filled with light so brilliant it should have blinded her. Instead, She found herself seeing with vision that transcended normal sight, witnessing the flow of spiritual energy as it raced along. Underground channels to restore balance to the sacred places dot above her. Far above the water's surface, she could sense the presence of Elena and Carlos and Dr. Crowfeather, their prayers adding strength to the ceremony. But she could also sense something else, the approaching machinery of destruction, the corporate powers gathering to destroy what the Guardians were working to protect. The ceremony was complete. The 7 Guardians unified and awakened. But the true test would come when that ancient power met modern determination to destroy what it protected. Rosa began her ascent toward the surface, toward sunlight and the confrontation that would determine whether the sacred places of her people would survive another generation, carrying with her the blessing of spirits who had waited more than a century for this moment of reunification. Rosa broke the surface of the sacred pool to find the world transformed. The 7 Guardian relics, now unified in their underwater chamber, had created a protective barrier that manifested as a shimmering dome of energy, extending from the canyon walls up into the desert sky. The air itself hummed with power, and every plant within the barrier's boundary showed signs of immediate revival. Desert sage unfurling new leaves, cottonwood saplings sprouting from ground that had been barren for years. But it was the sight of Jennifer Walsh standing at the canyon's edge with a convoy of Prometheus vehicles that made Rosa's heart race with urgency. The corporate team had arrived early, their heavy machinery already positioning for the noon blasting operation that would shatter the rock formations, regardless of any spiritual protection. The unified Guardian Circle, Elena breathed, helping Rosa from the water. The old medicine woman's eyes were wide with wonder as she studied the 7 sacred objects arranged in their perfect pattern on the red wool blanket. Each relic now glowed with steady inner light, their combined radiance creating a pillar of energy that rose from the earth, like a beacon visible to those with eyes trained to see such things. The circle pulsed with life, the water guardian arrowhead. At the north point, channeling the flow of underground springs, the bone flute at the east, calling winds that carried rain clouds from distant mountains. The crystal wheel at the south, gathering solar energy to feed the awakening plants. The jade pendant in the west sang with the voices of growing things, while the obsidian knife, silver bracelet, and stone bowl completed the sacred geometry that bound all the others together. "They're coming down," Carlos warned, pointing to the switchback trail where a line of vehicles was descending toward the canyon floor. Jennifer Walsh led the convoy in a military-style Humvee, followed by trucks carrying drilling equipment, explosives, and a small army of workers in hard hats and safety vests. Rosa could feel the power of the Guardians flowing through her body, like electricity, connecting her to every sacred site within hundreds of miles. She sensed springs bubbling to life in places that had been dry for decades, felt the underground aquifers refilling as the natural water cycle restored itself. But she also felt the approaching threat like a discordant note in the harmony of awakening spirits. "The barrier will hold," Dr. Crowfeather said with quiet confidence, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the air above the Guardian Circle. "I can feel the ancestors gathering, drawn by the unified power. This place is protected by forces beyond human law or corporate authority." But Jennifer Walsh seemed oblivious to any spiritual presence as her convoy reached the canyon floor. She climbed down from her vehicle with the determined efficiency of someone executing a carefully planned operation, followed by her legal team and a small army of workers who began unloading equipment with military precision. "Ms. Windwalker," Jennifer called across the water, her voice carrying the false courtesy of someone who believed she held all the winning cards. "I see you've been conducting some kind of ceremony. How charming. But I'm afraid we have federal permits and a very strict timeline." Rosa stood at the edge of the Guardian Circle, feeling power flowing between the 7 relics like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The unified Guardians were awake now, their protective energy extending far beyond this single canyon to encompass all the sacred places of her people. But would ancient spiritual power prove stronger than modern explosives and federal permits? "This is a protected site," Rosa replied, her voice carrying further than it should have in the desert air. "Sacred to my people and protected by forces you don't understand." Jennifer's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Protected by what? Federal law? I have the permits right here." She held up a folder thick with official documents. "Environmental impact study approved. Archaeological survey completed. Mineral rights confirmed. Everything legal and above board." As if to emphasize her point, Jennifer gestured to her work crew, who began setting up drilling equipment designed to place explosive charges in the rock formations surrounding the pool. The sound of generators and diesel engines filled the canyon, a mechanical roar that seemed to assault the very silence that made this place sacred. But then something unexpected happened. As the first drill bit touched the canyon wall, sparks flew that had nothing to do with metal on stone. The worker operating the drill stumbled backward with a cry of surprise. The equipment suddenly dead in his hands, despite the generator running at full power. "Equipment failure," one of the technicians called out. "Some kind of electrical interference?" Jennifer's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. "Try the backup units." But every piece of electronic equipment the Prometheus team attempted to operate failed the moment it came within 50 feet of the Guardian circle. Drill motors seized. GPS units displayed impossible coordinates. Even simple electronic measuring devices refused to function. "There must be some kind of electromagnetic field," Jennifer muttered, consulting with her technical team. "Underground mineral deposits, maybe unusual rock formations." Rosa felt the 7 Guardians pulsing with protective energy, their combined power creating a barrier that repelled not just physical intrusion, but the very technology that would destroy the sacred places they protected. The ancient spirits were making their presence known, asserting the priority of the sacred over the profitable. The first test of strength between the Guardian power and corporate determination had gone to the spirits. But Rosa could see Jennifer, Walsh regrouping, her legal mind already working on solutions that would overcome whatever interference the unified Guardians could provide. Rosa reached into the medicine bundle Elena had given her and withdrew the preserved tail feather from Chakan, her childhood hawk companion. The feather was over 60 years old, its russet and brown markings faded, but still beautiful, still carrying the essence of the wild spirit who had led her to the first Guardian so many years ago. As her fingers closed around the ancient feather, the air above the canyon suddenly filled with the piercing cries of raptors. They came from every direction, red-tailed hawks, golden eagles, Cooper's hawks, and species Rosa didn't recognize, their wings catching thermals that shouldn't have existed in the still morning air. The birds circled above the sacred pool in ever-tightening spirals, their voices creating a symphony of wildness that seemed to echo from the very stones of the canyon walls. Jennifer Walsh looked up at the gathering birds with the first expression of genuine uncertainty Rosa had seen on her face. "What the hell, where did they come from?" "The hawk spirits," Elena said simply, her weathered face upturned toward the aerial display. "Chakan has called his brothers and sisters to witness the ceremony. They remember the old agreements between the people and the winged ones." The largest of the hawks, a magnificent golden eagle with wingspan that seemed impossibly wide, descended to perch on the stone pillar beside the Guardian circle. The bird's eyes were ancient and intelligent, filled with recognition as they fixed on Rosa and the feather she held. This was no ordinary raptor, but something that bridged the physical and spiritual worlds, a messenger from the realm of the Guardians themselves. "This is absurd," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Birds they don't behave like this. There must be some explanation." But as she spoke, the gathered hawks began to descend, landing on the Prometheus equipment with deliberate precision. Their talons, designed by millions of years of evolution to grip struggling prey, made short work of hydraulic lines and electrical cables. Within minutes, the corporate machinery was not just disabled, but actively being dismantled by raptors, who seemed to understand exactly which components would cause the most damage. Get them off. Jennifer shouted to her workers, but the men in hard hats seemed reluctant to approach the birds. There was something in the hawk's bearing that spoke of protected space, of boundaries that should not be crossed. Rosa felt the power of Chakan's feather connecting her to the wild spirits gathering around the sacred pool. Through their eyes, she could see the true extent of the guardian barrier, not just the shimmering dome of energy that protected this canyon, but a vast network of spiritual protection extending across the entire Southwest. Sacred sites that had been dark for decades were awakening, their connection to the land's spiritual power restored by the unified guardians. "The old agreements are being renewed," Dr. Crowfeather said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "The treaty between the human people and the spirit world, the understanding that some places are too sacred to be bought or sold or destroyed." But Jennifer Walsh was not ready to surrender. Pulling out her satellite phone, one of the few electronic devices that still functioned, outside the Guardian barrier, she began making urgent calls to corporate headquarters, to federal agencies, to anyone with the authority to override what was happening in the canyon. "I need federal marshals," Rosa heard her saying. "Some kind of eco-terrorist interference with a legal development project. They're using trained birds to sabotage our equipment." The irony of the accusation might have been amusing under different circumstances. But Rosa could see the determination in Jennifer's eyes, the refusal to accept that there were forces in the world beyond corporate control. This was a woman who had built her career on the assumption that every problem had a legal solution. Every obstacle could be overcome with sufficient application of money and authority. "You don't understand what you're fighting," Rosa said, approaching Jennifer with Chakan's feather still in her hand. "This isn't about development versus environment. It's about the spiritual foundation that supports everything. The water that flows, the air that carries rain, the balance that keeps the world alive." For a moment, Jennifer's corporate mask slipped, revealing something Rosa recognized: fear, not of the supernatural, but of forces beyond human control. "You really believe this, don't you? You actually think these birds, this light show, these equipment failures, you think it's some kind of spiritual intervention?" "I know it is," Rosa replied. "Just as I know that the drought that's been starving our land for 3 years isn't natural. Your company has been manipulating water rights, diverting underground flows, creating artificial scarcity to make development seem like salvation." Jennifer's expression went completely still. "That's a very serious accusation. It's also true." Rosa held up the feather, and the golden eagle on the stone pillar spread its wings in response, the gesture somehow both blessing and warning. "The Guardians have shown me the truth. The underground channels that carry water to our sacred places, you've been blocking them, redirecting them, stealing the life force of the land itself. Around them, the assembled hawks continued their systematic dismantling of the Prometheus equipment, their work methodical and purposeful. But Rosa could sense something else building in the spiritual energy of the place, not just protection but transformation, a change that would reach far beyond this single canyon to touch every person who witnessed what was happening here. Final confrontation between the guardian spirits and corporate power was reaching its crescendo, and Rosa felt Chakan's spirit flowing through the ancient feather in her hand, lending her the courage to face whatever came next. 6 months later, Rosa stood beside the restored sacred pool, watching her great-niece Maria carefully arrange the 7 guardian relics in their new permanent display. The young woman handled each sacred object with the reverence of someone who had witnessed their power firsthand, who understood that she was being entrusted with more than artifacts. She was becoming a keeper of the spiritual foundation that protected her people's way of life. The medicine bundle that would pass to the next generation of guardians lay open on a blanket of red wool, its contents representing the bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary hope. Each relic had been documented, blessed, and prepared for the responsibility that would one day fall to Maria and others like her young people who had learned to see the sacred in the everyday, who understood that some things were worth more than money could measure. "Tell me again about the ceremony," Maria said, adjusting the position of the crystal wheel so that it caught the afternoon sunlight perfectly. What it felt like when all 7 guardians awakened together. Rosa smiled, remembering the moment when spiritual power had flowed through the underwater chamber like liquid light, restoring connections that had been broken for more than a century. "Like coming home," she said simply, "like finding a part of myself I hadn't known was missing." The transformation that had followed Jennifer Walsh's spiritual awakening had been swift and comprehensive. Within hours of witnessing the Guardian ceremony, the corporate project manager had experienced what she later described as a complete reorganization of my understanding of value. She had used her legal expertise to not only halt the Prometheus development, but to expose the water rights manipulation that had created the artificial drought. The federal investigation that followed had revealed a pattern of corporate water theft extending across multiple states, with Prometheus and its partners systematically diverting underground flows from tribal lands to support development projects. The legal settlement had not only restored natural water flow to dozens of sacred sites, but had established a trust fund for cultural preservation that would support traditional education for generations. Carlos emerged from the tribal council, building, his expression mixing satisfaction with the exhaustion of someone who had spent months navigating complex legal and political negotiations. As the newly elected chairman, he had overseen the transformation of Whispering Canyon from a struggling community facing extinction to a model of sustainable development that balanced traditional values with economic opportunity. "The environmental law practice is officially open," he announced, referring to the legal clinic that Jennifer Walsh had established on the reservation. 3 new lawyers, all specializing in water rights and sacred site protection. They're already fielding calls from tribes across the Southwest. Rosa nodded with satisfaction. Jennifer's transformation from corporate destroyer to indigenous rights advocate had been one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire experience. The spiritual awakening she had undergone during the Guardian ceremony had been so complete that she had resigned from Prometheus within days, dedicating her considerable legal skills to protecting the very places she had once sought to destroy. Elena approached slowly, her movements deliberate but her eyes bright with the energy of someone who had lived to see ancient prophecies fulfilled. At 91, the old medicine woman had become something of a celebrity, featured in documentaries about indigenous wisdom and the intersection of spirituality with environmental protection. "The young ones are coming back," Elena observed, gesturing toward a group of teenagers who were working with Dr. Begay to document traditional plant knowledge. "Not just visiting for summers, but coming home to stay. They see a future here now." It was true. The restoration of the sacred sites had been accompanied by an economic revival that few could have predicted. Cultural tourism, sustainable agriculture projects, renewable energy initiatives. The reservation was becoming a showcase for how traditional knowledge could inform modern solutions to contemporary problems. Rosa walked to the edge of the pool where she had scattered Miguel's ashes 6 months earlier. The water ran clear and deep now, fed by underground springs that had been restored to their natural flow. Fish had returned, native species that had survived in hidden pools during the drought years. Waterbirds nested in the revitalized wetlands. The entire ecosystem was healing itself with the resilience that came from deep roots and ancient adaptations. I keep thinking about what grandmother would say, Rosa mused, watching dragonflies dance above the water's surface. As she could see all this, the Guardians reunited, the water flowing again, young people learning the old ways. She would say the circle is complete, Elena replied, but also that every ending is a beginning. The Guardians are safe for now, but each generation must choose whether to honor the responsibilities that come with their protection. Rosa touched the medicine bundle that Maria would inherit, feeling the weight of promises kept and new obligations accepted. She had spent 40 years in the city, building a comfortable life removed from the complexities of reservation politics and spiritual responsibility. But the Guardians had called her home for a reason, and that purpose extended far beyond the ceremony that had awakened their power. The teaching position at the tribal college, Carlos said, approaching with papers that required her signature. You sure about staying? Rosa looked around the canyon that had shaped her childhood, at the young people who were choosing to build their futures on traditional foundations, at the sacred pool that reflected sky and clouds and the wings of returning birds. Her Phoenix apartment sat empty now, her city life reduced to boxes in storage, while she discovered what it meant to be truly home. Unsure, she said, accepting the papers that would make her the college's first professor of indigenous environmental wisdom. Someone needs to teach them how to listen to the water, how to read the stories written in stone, how to hear the voices that speak from wind and fire. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rosa heard the cry of a red-tailed hawk echoing from the cliffs above. She looked up to see a magnificent bird circling the sacred pool, its wings catching the last light like polished copper. For a moment, she could have sworn it was Chakan himself, returned to witness the fulfillment of the journey they had begun together so many years ago. The new medicine bundle was complete. The Guardians were safe, and the sacred places of her people would continue to nurture those wise enough to listen to their ancient songs. The circle that had begun with a young girl's love for a wounded hawk had come full round, carrying within it the promise that some things would always transcend the temporary concerns of any single generation.